This is the top yoke and instrument assembly and everything of the club bike, and I was just doing a sort of general assessment of things. It's quite nice to see the old jelly top lights are actually got intact lenses. But one of the things that's been requested is that the bike have indicators, and this is what gets referred to as the snuff box, and it's the old style lighting switch. This was a fairly common cheap light switch on Italian machines, and when you see road tests of Marinis that talk about the poor quality switchgear, this is what they're talking about. It's not that it's unreliable. Everyone I've ever come across has worked okay, but this thing ergonomically is a disaster. You know, this is your high and low beam, and then you've got side lights and main lights on the rocker switch, with on these early bikes the side lights being turned on and off with the key, and that's your horn push. And there are no indicator switch built in here, and trying to find room to stack up the actual a suitable position for the indicator switch. I mean, the indicator switch, I've taken it off at the moment, was actually over here, so really not very convenient. And this switch is actually broken. It operates, but it's going to fail soon anyway. There's a big crack in the plastic there, so I think the solution to that is to fit the later style switch gear, and I'll just show you that on my 77 bike. This is the later style switch gear, and you've got the horn push and high beam flash, a rocker for the indicators, which a lot of people say they find awkward to use. I particularly in finding centre, but I've always found that I just put my thumb across and put it flat and it centres. Then you've got high and low beam, side lights, main lights, and this is an original switch from 77. Every Marini I've come across that hasn't had the lightning switch actually damaged in a crash, the switch has worked fine. I don't think I've actually had a Marini that I've owned and ridden that hasn't had its original switchgear, so it's not inherently unreliable. So I've probably got one of these on the shelf, and I'll convert the bike over to this style. I've decided I am going to clean and re-lubricate the head bearings. So the yokes obviously need to come out, and I need to take the instruments off and handlebars off, which means unhooking the throttle cables and the clutch cable. So let's get started on that. So I'm going to back I've pulled back the cable boot here. You can just about see it in frame there. I'm going to screw in the adjuster, get some slack in the cable, and there's a notch in the adjuster that'll line up and allow me to pull the cable out and get the nipple out. And this is an old style cable where the nipple is separate. I actually, in some ways I prefer that style. I'm going to push the boot over the nipple to keep it safe. I don't want to delve into the wiring just yet, so I'm just going to demount the switch from the clutch lever. I'll remove the screws and the switch cover and mount and put them safely aside. I've got to unhook the throttle cables, and that's very easily and quickly done. If I pull them down, the plastic holder block slides out of the throttle, and then in theory the cables will unslot from it like so. Now, this needs to be stored very carefully because, as far as I'm aware, nobody stocks it as a replacement piece. There's nothing to hold it in when the cables aren't holding it in place, and they go missing, and you end up with a scrap throttle assembly. So with the holder off, I just have to unhook the nipples, and the cables are off, and I can remove the handlebars completely. The speedo and tacho are just push fit into the rubber holders. They often stick, just due to a little bit of corrosion on here, which in some ways is a good thing. It stops them rotating. There would originally have been a chromed plastic surround which located via 3 small holes with clips on the back that put a little bit of compression on the rubber to hold the instruments in place. Those have nearly always been lost. There are now stainless steel replacements. With the on the speedo, the only thing, once the cable's off, the only thing then holding it in place is the backlight. So I just need to grab that with a pair of pliers because it's tight. And that's the speedo off and stored carefully. Now the tacho is an electronic style, which are very hard to get hold of. Don't have the best reputation for reliability. So I need to be careful with it. And again, you've got a instrument lighting in there. So we'll get that one first. And then we have 2 push-on spade terminals and 1 screw terminal for the earth connection. So we'll get that earth terminal first. Try not to drop the nuts. Put the nuts straight back on. And there we go. And again, very carefully stored. Now, just for convenience, I'm going to take the instrument assembly off. These are countersunk screws, and they can be quite tight to break loose. So now I need to remove the top and bottom yokes, and the first thing to do is the top yoke. So find a suitable socket for the top nut. It's a 30mm, and wasn't tight. Now this top nut, in conjunction with the clamp on the top yoke, is what sets the tension on the steering bearings. The top yoke, once the clamp is undone, should just slide off quite easily. If it doesn't, you may need to wedge the slot. I'm just going to hold the bottom yoke remove the dust cap, and yeah, although well greased and smooth, the grease in here looks to be quite old. And this is the top cone race, and it's a light press fit onto the steering stem. So we have to tap the steering stem out through that top bearing. And I've borrowed the end of my press so I can drop it over the spindle and protect the end from damage whilst I use the rubber mallet. And that's so it's only a very light press fit, that's already moving. And it doesn't take much movement before the balls in the lower race will be free. So you can see the balls on the lower race are now exposed. And we can drop the bottom yoke out. Most of the balls are still sitting in grease in the lower cup. So all of them. And if we return to the upper brace. I can lift out the cone bearing, and I think you can see full complement of balls in place. There are 22 balls top and bottom, and they're available from they're in standard imperial size, and they're pretty cheap, so it's quite often advisable just to fit a new set of balls. I think Northwestern Motorcycles charge something like 2 or 3p each, plus tax. So I'm going to leave the top ones in at the moment. I'm going to count up the bottom and make sure I've got a full complement, and get everything cleaned up. And I'll probably take this opportunity to remove the tank, which will make it easier for adapting the wiring and servicing the carburetors and the valve clearances. Taking the tank off is quite straightforward. You first have to remove the seat by slackening. You don't have to remove them. The seat mounting knobs either side. And then the seat should just lift. You slide it backwards off the mounting pins, and then the rear tank mounting, there should be a rubber around this hook. It's not uncommon to find them missing. I have a little stock of old inner tubes. The older the better, because if you've got old enough ones, they're made of natural rubber, but a slice off them makes a nice band for things like retaining tanks or strapping bits of steel stock together for storage. And then, depending on the year of the bike, they either used a bolt mounting or a slide-on mounting, and obviously the slide-on mountings slide off, and the bolt-on mountings unbolt. Of course, you have to disconnect the fuel hoses from the tank, and you've got, on an original setup, you've got a manual reserve tap on the right hand rear, and the electrically operated main tap on the left hand front. So you've also got to unplug the wiring from the solenoid, and these old clear pipes tend to go very hard after a few years, and these pipes are a good few years old, so I just went straight through them with a knife rather than risk damaging the taps. So now the tank is ready to come off. So with the fuel tank off, we have the airbox exposed in all its glory, and these were something that a lot of people have dumped over the years and mounted pod filters, and there's a couple of reasons why that isn't necessarily a good idea. As with many bikes, the airbox was actually quite carefully designed and provides an equal and as still as possible airflow to both carburetors, and fitting one filter facing forwards and another filter facing backwards, it's going to make it quite hard to get them set up. It's not impossible. Lots of people have reported getting bikes working well with that setup, but even more people have never been able to get a bike to run right. The airbox in standard tune is not restrictive. Potentially it becomes so, and as I say, a lot of people have dumped these, particularly on Japanese 4-cylinder bikes. Taking the airbox off and getting it back on again, particularly when the carburetor rubbers have hardened up, is quite difficult, and pod filters have often been fitted just to make it easier than removing and refitting the airbox. You may have people have taken it to a dyno and said, oh, I've picked up a couple of horsepower with these. Well, you don't ride on the dyno. The dyno doesn't have an 80-mile-an-hour airstream blowing over the bike and affecting the running. So often the stock airbox is one of the keys to making it run correctly. A secondary thing is this an early bike with the metal inlet manifolds. The even earlier ones didn't have this insulator block in the middle, they were just one-piece metal. And they have a reputation, because of the vibration transmitted, of wearing out the slides on these square slide Delautos. So Marini converted to a rubber inlet manifold. Well, if you get rid of the airbox, you lose the support function of the inlet rubber, and the carburetor ends up just suspended on its rubber inlet manifold. And particularly with the effects of modern fuel, split intake rubbers are reasonably common, even with the extra support. So it's in a way asking for trouble to mount the carburetors with no support. Some people do it right when they put pod filters on. They make up a mechanical support. If you have got running problems and you can't source an original airbox, a sensible compromise is to make a plate that mounts where the bottom of the standard airbox mounts, and put your pod filters on top of that plate. So then at least you'll have both your filters seeing broadly the same airflow conditions up and under the tank, and sheltered from the weather somewhat. So I've noticed that we've got a little bit of wiring needs attending to. This bike has been looked after, but it's had a lot of little modifications over the years, so none of the original kind of wiring supports are there. It's cable ties, and this is probably one of the connections that gets flexed the most, seeing as it's the wiring to the tachometer. So we can take care of that. And there's a connector block on a little plate here, and poor connections here are often a cause of electrical issues, and frequently all you have to do is pull the connectors off one by one, give them a good clean, put them back with a bit of dielectric grease or a bit of Vaseline, and your electrical gremlins will disappear. There's obviously an earthing point up here, which has got at least two that I can see non-standard earths on it, one of which at the moment didn't do anything. It was just slid in here. This is mains cable, which is giving it a connection straight back to the battery. And the ignition switch is in this slightly peculiar position down here. Later ones were moved out and forward a bit, because if you've got a key fob flapping in the wind, it can take all the paint off your side panel. And if one of these switches gets damaged or gets a serious amount of water ingress, they're actually fairly well sealed as standard. They've got a decent rubber boot on them, and there's even a rubber seal on the front. But it's possible for them to go faulty and damage the ignition modules. So that's something we'll be dealing with later on. So as I say, I'll be getting all the bearing cups and the front of the headstock cleaned up. It'll just get a wipe down with a rag to remove the road dirt. And when everything's clean, I'll do the build up and go through the adjustment procedure. Here's the bottom yoke all cleaned up, and the bottom bearing cone is looking pretty good. You can see there's a little bit of corrosion, but it's not actually on the bearing track. The bearing track's a shiny line all the way around, and there's no evidence of brittling. That's dents caused by the ball bearings. So that's fortunately in very good condition. These races are very expensive to replace and a bit of a pain, because you can either cut the bottom race off if it really is junk. Otherwise you have to press the entire steering stem out from the top, and you have to get this casting pretty hot, because if you put enough pressure on to do it cold, they'll actually buckle in the middle, particularly around the steering lock hole. So that's all ready to go back together.